Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to ACOP 2022. I'm Caroline, a principal psychologist with the Police Psychological Services Department, Singapore Police Force. I will be the facilitator for this keynote session. Thanks very much for joining us. Just a gentle reminder not to record the sessions, and if you have questions, to post them in the chat function. Okay. Today we have our keynote keynote speaker for today, so sorry, late at night. Dr. Cassandra Cross, okay, she's live with us here. She will be sharing with us understanding human vulnerabilities to fraud, the offender's toolbox, and she will be taking questions in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation. Just a little bit about Dr. Cross. She's an associate professor, School of Justice, Queensland University of Technology. Dr. Cross is an international expert on fraud, having worked with victims and related organizations globally. Since taking up her position at QUT in 2012, she has published over 70 outputs across the policing, prevention, and victim support aspects of fraud. She is co-author with Professor Mark Button of the book Cyber Fraud Scams and Their Victims, and this was published in 2017. So without further ado, it is my privilege and honor to introduce to all of us Dr. Cross for this keynote session. Dr. Cross, please.
Thank you very much. I'll just look to share my slides. Oops. Okay, can I just get a thumbs up for an indication that that's working? Silence, I'm going to say yes. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's fabulous to be here, and I want to extend my thanks to the committee for inviting me to be here today. So my name's Cassandra Cross, as was indicated, and I'm from the School of Justice at QUT. And today I'm going to be talking about fraud. So for those of you who are familiar with my work, it's been an area that I've been researching for over a decade now across both victim and offending perspectives. And today I'm going to be talking specifically around some of the human vulnerabilities to fraud and what we've observed in different circumstances, and most recently with COVID as well, how that certainly had a big impact. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I live and work here in Brisbane. So I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the lands where I live and work, and I pay respect to their elders past and present. So I realise that there's a lot of you here who will be familiar with fraud and certainly have a lot of expertise in that area, but I do think it's always good to get an understanding just around what we're talking about. So if we look at the definition of fraud, it's around gaining a financial advantage over somebody through means of deception. So fraud is definitely not new, but it has very much evolved with technology. There are many different ways to perpetrate fraud, and whilst we're very familiar in an online environment in recent years, I think it's important to also recognise that fraud occurs both online and offline contexts, and offenders will use any means of communication possible in order to, I guess, be successful in their approach. So many of the victims that I've spoken to across different projects, many of them have communicated initially online or connected online with an offender, but that evolves across all communication platforms and in some cases has resulted in face-to-face contact. If we look at the role of technology, it's really important to understand how it is an enabler for offenders to target potential victims and to perpetrate their schemes. But it certainly hasn't created fraud, but it has, I would say, exponentially increased the ability of offenders to target victims. So we've seen this just with the increased connectivity across all societies here in Australia, in Singapore and in many different countries that people may be representing today, that technology has really brought us closer together, and that has many challenges in terms of offending behaviour. If we think about the different categories of fraud, I've argued in my work that there's endless plot lines that offenders use. So in talking to victims, I guess one of the things that is very apparent is that there is some sort of unique aspect to everyone's story, but at the other end of the spectrum, there are also commonalities across many of the different approaches that offenders use. The consistent characteristic is always a request for money or personal information, because if we go back to what the actual goal of fraud is, it's that financial advantage. In many cases, that will be through a direct request for money transfer from a victim to an offender, but it can also be around the harvesting or gathering of personal information in order to use that to obtain other lines of credit, such as loans or open other bank accounts, and commit various forms of identity crime. If we think about the common categories of fraud that we witness across statistics globally, advanced fee fraud is a term you may or may not be familiar with, but essentially is when someone's asked to send a small amount of money in promise of a larger return. So we see this a lot with investment schemes, with inheritance, and with lottery notifications as well. The second category is around romance fraud, and that's an area that I've focused on quite heavily in recent years, where offenders use what's perceived to be a genuine relationship in order to defraud a victim. And the third one up here is certainly gaining prominence here in Australia and globally as well, is what's known as business email compromise. So this really exploits established relationships through impersonating business colleagues and trusted suppliers. So in these particular instances, offenders are able to hack into the email account or system of a supplier. They're able to then look at the correspondence that's going between that and customers. And in many cases, they will intercept payments and change payment details so that an unsuspecting victim will pay an invoice or transfer a large amount of money to who they think is a genuine business transaction, but is actually going straight to the offender. We've seen this recently in Australia in terms of real estate and some of the very large settlement fees that go through. If we just look at some fraud statistics, I've got some here for 2020 across the world, but I also have some on the next slide in terms of updating for Australia for 21. So in Australia, 851 million, which was an increase from 2019 from 632. The US, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, indicates $3.3 billion was lost to Americans and to others who had reported, which again is a significant increase. Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, if we look at all of the many different countries, not just those in the global north, but worldwide, there are significant statistics for fraud victimization, and these are rising globally. And we also know that COVID-19 has had a significant impact in terms of cybercrime. So there's some really good research that's come out of the UK in particular that documents a statistically significant rise from COVID and cybercrime broadly, but looking at some of the categories, and romance fraud in particular did observe a statistically significant increase. And it's just staggering really to think about some of these statistics and to recognise that behind each of this is a victim. So last week here in Australia, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission released their annual Targeting Scams report, which is our annual indicator around fraud victimisation. In 2021, Australians lost over $2 billion. So when you think back to the 2020 stat that I've just presented, around 851 million, within 1 year here in Australia, that more than doubled, which is a very significant figure, and one that I think should bear some warning for governments and other agencies. If we think about the top three categories that cause the most financial harm, they are those that I've already mentioned. So the primary, I guess, driver in terms of the doubling of the losses here in Australia was around investment schemes, where that more than doubled from about 328 million up to 701 million. We see 227 to payment redirection scams, which are the business email compromise I just outlined. And coming in third was romance scams at 142 million. So that may seem quite stable, but what we are also seeing is an increase in offenders using relationships, using romance fraud as a means to getting people to invest in cryptocurrency investment schemes. And cryptocurrency, I think, is really a significant driver at the moment of a lot of victimization. And there are certainly less warning signs from a victim perspective if you're asked to invest money in what you think is a genuine investment scheme in cryptocurrency, rather than being asked to send a payment directly to an offender. So a lot of those statistics from romance fraud are actually being captured in the investment category. If we just do a quick scan of what we know about fraud, we know that it has a very low reporting rate, and even lower, for online fraud offences. So if we just think about the statistics that I've just presented globally, and I guess for me most relevant here in Australia, knowing that most research indicates less than a third of fraud is actually reported, and to be at $2 billion or to be at $3.3 billion in the US, that there is a significant amount of victimization that isn't reported and that those figures do not account for. It also doesn't account for the non-financial harms that are experienced by victims, which is the fourth point here, around the fact that the impact of fraud is far greater than those monetary losses, and it can impact on physical health, emotional well-being, relationships, unemployment, homelessness, and in extreme cases, victims will attempt or commit suicide. We do know that victims have great difficulty in trying to access what's termed the fraud justice network. So fraud is quite unique in terms of, I guess, the multitude of agencies that are able to respond to this. It's not just police, but can also be consumer protection, banks and financial institutions, and a wide range of government and non-government agencies, depending on, I guess, the circumstances and the context that the victim's involved in. One of the largest challenges that we do face in this area is around shame and stigma associated with victimization. So there is a very strong attitude of victim blaming towards fraud victims, with a perception that victims are greedy, that they're gullible, that they're uneducated, and that they should have known better. And that can be a very, I guess, overwhelming barrier to try and overcome. And it really inhibits the ability of victims to disclose to family and friends and seek support and assistance. And it also stops them from reporting in many circumstances. And those who do report, who are captured in the statistics that I talked about, in many cases will experience shame and humiliation from those agencies to whom they've reported. We also know that fraud is not generally a priority of policing agencies. I think the exception in some ways is the United Kingdom, who do have some agencies particularly set up, City of London Police, for example. But the research historically indicates that fraud is one of those crime types that, despite the magnitude of losses that we're seeing increase on an annual basis, doesn't necessarily get the same attention as other crime types. If we think about the current state of fraud, in many instances, it is a high volume crime that can vary in value, from small transactions from a large number of people through to some significant financial losses. So if we just think about, I guess, the different approaches that offenders can use, if you think about an offender perhaps trying to get a small amount of money from a large number of victims, they're probably less likely to report, less likely for it to have a significant impact, and they may kind of just write it off as a bad decision or as a loss that's not really worth following up. But then there are others who do experience substantial financial losses. So as I mentioned with the business email compromise, in the context of real estate, it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've spoken to many victims over the recent years who have lost up to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the amount of money that offenders are gaining as a result of fraud is certainly significant, and offenders will really invest their time and effort if they think they can continue to get a financial reward from victims. We do know that fraud, as I mentioned, is perpetrated in an online environment for a lot of circumstances. And this crosses jurisdictional boundaries and places some significant challenges for law enforcement, both locally and internationally. So our policing is very much, I guess, based upon geographical, physical boundaries. And it's very difficult with the internet, with that being kind of one universal jurisdiction as such. Offenders know this and they really leverage that for their own advantage, that it is difficult for police, for example, here in Australia, to be able to try and track and arrest offenders who are likely overseas and targeting victims here, and vice versa. We know that offenders do like to target victims in other countries because they know this works for them, and the likelihood of actually being arrested and prosecuted is really quite low. We also know that the policing of fraud is ineffective and unsatisfactory from both victim and organisational perspectives. So there's certainly a huge level of victim dissatisfaction and anger with the system in terms of victims not really feeling that they've been heard, that they've been acknowledged, and very few will be able to get their money back. And that can certainly be a source of immense frustration and anger and hurt. But from a policing perspective as well, it's really difficult for police who usually with other crime types have abilities to investigate and to try and catch the offender and get an outcome of some sort. And in many circumstances, they are just simply unable to do that in the context of fraud, particularly in the online environment. We know too, for the current state, that there is a strong focus on prevention and I guess on individual actions. So if we think about all the prevention advice out there, it is very much targeted at individuals around, I guess, having strong passwords, not clicking on links. I'm thinking about the type of information that we share. And that's important, and certainly having those things and antivirus and all the technological solutions that we have available to us, those tools are important. But they won't prevent fraud victimisation in its entirety. And I think we have to start thinking about some of the, I guess, the broader structural enablers for fraud if we're going to be able to prevent and disrupt it to a greater level. One of the other challenges with the offenders is just the fact that they are invisible and faceless in many circumstances. So offenders are usually unlikely to use their own identities. Many of them will take on the identities of other persons and commit identity crime in the process. And it does make it very difficult for victims to know who they're talking to, but also then for police and other agencies to be able to track that down. And I think that's one of the challenges we face with the victim blaming as well, that we have the victim here in front of us, we know who they are, and it's very easy to focus on what we perceive they should and shouldn't have done, as opposed to laying blame at the feet of the offenders for what they've actually perpetrated. If we think about victimisation, we'd certainly, I guess there's a lot of research looking to drive the profile for fraud victims and to find out who is more susceptible to different approaches. The research is a little mixed in this. There's certainly no one particular indicator or one particular demographic or socioeconomic status or anything like that that really does point to the potential for fraud victimisation. So I will always argue that everyone has a vulnerability or weakness that if targeted in the right way at the right time can lead to victimisation. And that makes it really challenging in this space because we don't necessarily have those risk factors or potential factors that we can target. But there is research to indicate there are some factors with particular types of fraud. For example, for romance fraud, that there are some psychological factors that do appear to be linked in terms of victimisation. So if we think about increased levels of romantic idealism, so this idea of love at first sight, those that have higher beliefs in love at first sight are more likely to become victims. We do know too, in terms of some of the stats that we have for reporting, that women usually lose larger amounts to romance fraud and men usually lose larger amounts of money to investment schemes. So there are some types and some indicators that we can look at, but certainly it's a little mixed across all the different fraud types. There are some life events as well that I think make people more susceptible. So if we think about significant life events such as, I guess, the death of a partner or a divorce or even retirement being a positive significant life event, they are kind of transition points in many ways that offenders can target specifically to try and improve their success rate. So there's no guarantee that these factors will lead to victimisation, but I think we need to look at how they do make people more vulnerable. I would also argue that COVID-19 has significantly altered the fraud profile of a large amount of society here in Australia and globally, just in terms of, I guess, the large amount of disruption that we've experienced in the last 2.5 years. For many individuals, there's been a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. Employment they may have lost their jobs or certainly reduced hours, which has led to financial stress. So I think those are factors that potentially have increased the susceptibility of individuals to consider some fraudulent approaches that they might not have been as open to before COVID back in 2019. But I would argue that vulnerability is neither fixed nor static, and it can really be seen to be across a continuum. So speaking with so many victims about their circumstances, it is interesting just in terms of how offenders were able to successfully leverage a particular vulnerability or just a particular weakness at a point in time that was successful in a particular event, but may not have been successful under different circumstances at a different time. If we think about the stereotype of victims, and I have touched on this a little bit, there are some stereotypes about who does become a victim, that they're generally older persons, as I mentioned, that they're greedy, gullible, uneducated, and deserve what happens to them. I would argue that both are not really founded in research. Older victims are very much attractive targets for fraud, but we do know that victimisation cuts across all demographics. Having said that, the latest report here in Australia that I referred to, the targeting scams for 2021, did note a doubling of losses for those aged over 65, as well as significant increases for Indigenous Australians, those with culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds, and those with a disability. So I think at the moment we are seeing an overrepresentation of vulnerable members of society who are experiencing significant losses to fraud, and it is important to recognise that and to think about how we can try and stem that for coming years. I would say too, something that I think we fail to acknowledge quite often is just the skill of the offenders in many cases, that they are highly skilled tech-savvy individuals who can effectively manipulate victims. And I think this is kind of one of the points that we need to recognise more, is just the ways that offenders are able to employ different techniques in order to gain success from their victimisation. So as I mentioned, if we think about why fraud is successful, how it works, offenders in many cases are skilled. I do acknowledge that there are those out there that just kind of put the blanket approaches out there and don't necessarily require a lot of skill in order to try and gain their targets. But generally speaking, from the victims that I've spoken to, their offenders were able to identify, a particular to the person, a particular circumstance or factors that were about their vulnerability, and they were able to manipulate it and exploit it very successfully in order to gain money. So offenders can work in groups to target victims, and we're starting to learn more, I guess, about the role of organised crime in this and the way that offenders in many circumstances will work collaboratively in order to perpetrate their offences. We do also know that offenders will bombard victims with communications across all platforms. So as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of fraud in the online environment, but it does kind of cut across all communication platforms. And it's not unusual for offenders to, leverage multiple communication channels in order to keep that communication and kind of keep, that connection with their victim. Offenders always have an answer for any question that potentially could be plausible. And this is one of the challenges in working with victims in this space that some of you may be familiar with. That it is difficult to convince victims in many cases that the person they're speaking to isn't genuine, that the opportunity isn't genuine, and that the offender may not be who they say they are. Offenders are very good at being able to, make it plausible, make every question that is levelled at them, they generally have a response to. They're able to tailor their circumstances to real life events that are happening, and COVID is a great example of that. But we've seen that prior to COVID, and we'll continue to see that with approaches that are not related to COVID. And I think the other challenge too is that victims don't necessarily believe they're susceptible to fraud. So nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks that they're going to be a victim of fraud that day. And it's very difficult in many circumstances when approached by an offender in a particular way to actually identify that it's fraud. So offenders are certainly getting better at the techniques, their tactics for trying to attract potential victims. And in many cases, it can be quite plausible and seem quite innocent and benign at the beginning as to how that connection's formed. And then once that connection is there, it's very difficult to break it. So I thought I'd look at, outline some of the techniques of offending that we know offenders do use. So offenders are highly skilled at using social engineering techniques. So this also relates quite heavily on the principles of persuasion by Cialdini. So examples here I've put are authority, urgency, and scarcity. So authority, we see that very often in the types of identities that offenders use. With romance fraud, I've done some work quite recently looking at the use of military identities, where offenders will use a military identity on their dating profiles to try and attract potential victims. We see this in many phishing emails that come through from banks or from different government agencies, and we certainly saw it globally through COVID with text messages or emails coming through or approaches purporting to be from government, talking about contact tracing, talking about exposure to COVID, and requiring individuals to click on links or send money for test kits or vaccines, etc. So there certainly is a use of authority to try and assert that power and control and influence in the situation. We also see urgency used quite often in terms of the requirement for payment, and that's to try and get the victim not to think about the circumstances, to kind of react in the moment. Whereas I guess a prevention tool is we really want victims to stand back and think about something and talk to someone, perhaps do their own searches to verify whether or not it's true or not. But offenders will really, I guess, press the victim, the urgency, whether it's a medical or criminal justice incident or a reason or the opportunity will just disappear, which we see a lot with the investment schemes. So this sense of urgency that if you don't pay now, react in this particular moment, that something really bad will happen, you'll lose the opportunity, someone will be hurt, or there'll be other negative consequences. And the same with scarcity, particularly, I guess, with investment that we're seeing the significant increases in. Offenders will use successful marketing techniques and be able to, I guess, persuade individuals to invest in a particular scheme in the moment, saying that if they don't act now, then the opportunity will be lost and the potential, I guess, gains that they could achieve will also be lost. Another area that I've been looking at, I guess specifically, is the use of psychological abuse tactics. And we know this from domestic violence research. So there is a large body in existence that looks at psychological abuse and how it's used within a domestic violence context. And I guess some of the research I've done has looked to establish that within the context of fraud. So I guess I've looked at it particularly in the case of romance fraud, but I do think there is scope to look at this across fraud more broadly. And I think what's really significant about this is the fact that offenders are able to use these techniques and to exert an enormous amount of power and control and gain compliance from victims, even without geographical proximity. So in most cases, victims and offenders are not in the same jurisdiction. They're communicating, as I mentioned, through all the different communication platforms and different channels, but they're not close to each other with a physical presence, and yet they are able to exert a huge amount of power and influence over the individual victim and get them to do actions that they would otherwise not do. So we see isolation, certainly used in many circumstances, where offenders will try to isolate the victim from their family and friends and talk about secrecy, I guess particularly in the context of romance fraud, that no one will understand the relationship. So we have to keep it secret, don't tell anyone, which therefore means that if the victim has lost money or has questions or is just unsure about what's being presented to them, that they don't have that network of family and friends and others who they can seek advice from. If they don't know that they're dating in the first place and talking to this individual, it removes that layer of protection, which is certainly a deliberate ploy on the part of the offender. We also see other techniques such as withdrawal, where a victim might be corresponding with an offender, doesn't send the money or doesn't do something that they've asked. So the offender just kind of ghosts them for a period of time, just withdraws their presence and goes dark. And that can be a source of significant anxiety for a victim who, I guess, in the context of a relationship, if your partner just disappears for a period of time unexplained, it can create a lot of anxiety about the well-being of that person and what's happened. There is also a lot of just verbal abuse that happens within the context of communications. So I've read a number of transcripts from victims who have shared with me, I guess, the text of their communications with offenders, and it can be really brutal in terms of the language and the way that the offender will speak to the victim when they're not getting what they want, when the victim is suspicious or asks questions or refuses to send money or do what the offender is asking. So these are, I think it's the combination of these factors that really do work to effectively victimize individuals. And I think we need a much better understanding about these techniques and about how they are currently being used by offenders in order to try and tailor our prevention messages in a more effective and meaningful way. If we think about technology, as I mentioned right back at the beginning, it hasn't created fraud, but it has very much changed the way that it's perpetrated. If we think about some of the, I guess, the characteristics of online communication around the anonymity, the challenges in being able to verify people that we're talking to and how you establish trust in an online environment, it is very different compared to face-to-face. There's previous research that talks about, I guess, this development of a hyper-personal relationship in an online environment where people are more likely to open up and share a greater level of detail and intimacy about themselves and about their lives behind a computer screen than what they would in face-to-face interactions. So that can certainly be a challenge for prevention and to try and talk to victims and try and, I guess, educate them around what's happening. We know that there are many technological efforts in place to reduce fraud, and there are spam filters, antivirus algorithms, etc. But they're certainly not foolproof. And I think for me, fraud is very much a human problem, and we need to recognise the interaction between technology and the human element in order to better prevent it and better disrupt it. We're also seeing, I guess, the evolution of technology and how it changes offending. So artificial intelligence, for example, is able to create deep fakes, to create synthetic images and identities, so that some of our prevention advice in this space actually will become redundant. So telling individuals to do reverse image searches on photos from dating profiles, for example, if an offender has created a synthetic image for that identity, then it won't return any hits, and it becomes really quite difficult around that particular prevention message. So fraud is very much, I think, about the interaction between the human and the technological, and we need to get better at that. So just wrapping up now, I think one of the things that I always leave with is just how we can improve in this space. So I think we need to recognise the reality of fraud victimisation, that it can be very different to some of our stereotypes and to what we perceive about this, that we need to acknowledge the potential for fraud victimisation for ourselves individually, but for those around us. It's not constructive to think it will never happen to us. I would hazard a guess that there will be people here online or who listen to this who have been victims and who have, for whatever reason, had an approach that was successful for them, and there shouldn't be any shame or stigma associated with that. We need to acknowledge and accept that technical expertise will not always protect against fraud. It's kind of an important relationship, but it certainly won't stop it from happening completely. And one of the, I guess, the last message is just about talking openly and constructively with friends and family and colleagues about fraud. I think we really need to destigmatize it, talk about it more openly so that we take away some of that power and silence that the offenders are relying upon, and that we can have these conversations with each other to try and improve it. So I'm going to stop there, and my contact details are here if anyone wants to get in touch. I am also on Twitter, and I've got a large range of publications that I'm willing to share or send to anyone who's interested. So thank you very much.
Okay, everyone. That was a very interesting presentation by Dr. Cross. Thank you so much, Dr. Cross. We have a number of questions, but I'm just going to give you the first one, okay? And then I will scroll down to the rest. Okay, so the first question is, how do we make victims decrease their scam susceptibility? That means increase their awareness based on your research.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So thank you to whoever asked that. I think there's a range of different ways that we need to approach it. So I think we need to increase the awareness and education about fraud, but I think we need to do it in a more meaningful way. So at the moment, we've got a lot of prevention messages, I guess, that try and target all the different categories of fraud and the different ways that you might be targeted, but offenders will change the way that they perpetrate offences. So I think back to over a decade ago when I started, a lot of victims were being asked to send money via remittance agencies through MoneyGram and Western Union, for example. So there was a lot of advice and prevention around don't send via these agencies. So offenders moved on to bank-to-bank transfers and the recruitment of money mules to do that. Again, banks responded, prevention messages have changed, and now we're seeing an increase in cryptocurrencies, as I highlighted at the beginning. So I think we need to think about our messaging at a broader level. I think we also just, as I said, need to reduce some of the shame and stigma about this. We need to talk about it more openly so that if people are approached, that they're more likely to maybe take a moment to talk to someone about it, to seek advice, to have a conversation, as opposed to being unsure and not really, I guess, confident or comfortable to share their experience or to seek advice from someone. So there's some of the things we can do. There's also technical aspects that we can try and do from a banking perspective. I think banks can certainly do more about around some of the transactions that happen, but cryptocurrency do pose a significant challenge because by their very nature, they're uniquely kind of anonymous and can't be traced in the same way that bank-to-bank transactions can be. So there's things to do, but there's certainly a lot of challenges in the area.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Cross. You also mentioned, being more sensitive to victim and having some, idea of how victims might be stigmatized and in the process. Maybe the other question that we can ask, because it's being typed in the chat, okay, is that whether you have any thoughts or advice on how we can adopt a victim-sensitive approach to both the formulation and implementation of scam prevention initiatives.
Oh, again, thank you. That's a great question. I think one of the things that we can do up front that I think everyone can do is when I'm talking to victims, I guess one of the challenges that they face and one of the biggest issues that they face is just not being heard and not being acknowledged. So in many cases, those victims who kind of are brave enough and realize they've been defrauded and go to the police or go to an agency have had a very negative experience. And in many cases, they've kind of been trivialized or they've been dismissed or they've been blamed for what's happened. So I think first and foremost, anyone who's working in an agency that potentially will interact with someone who's been a victim, the biggest thing you can do is just acknowledge the individual and to listen to them around their experience. Doesn't necessarily mean you're making promises to them or mean that you're actually able to do anything for them, but just actually I guess listening to the victim and validating their experience for many is a really important step. And for some victims that I've spoken to, even though they weren't able to get their money back, nothing changed. The way that they were treated by agencies has made a significant difference in terms of how they viewed it and their ability to recover from that. So I think it's just about recognizing that offenders are really good at what they do, that victims don't deliberately choose to do this, to try and challenge some of the stereotypes we have and the reality about victimization, how it occurs, and to think about that when we're talking to or interacting with victims.
Yeah, I think that's really very important to be supportive of victims, because we've seen victims like, they don't just lose money, but they also lose their sense of self-respect, their sense of justice and things like that. Okay, the other question that now we're talking about, victims in general as individuals, there's some broader kind of questions, okay, that pertain to more agencies. And if I can, oops, what happened to the chat? Hang on, sorry. kind of lost the chat for a while.
That's all right.
Okay, yeah. All right. So I think people have asked two questions. Okay, the first one that's a bit broader is that online scams have been really booming, as seen in your first few slides. Okay, are there areas that are relevant that relevant agencies or governments can do to step in and prevent that? This is more policy level,
Yep.
based on your research.
Oh, I would absolutely agree with that statement. I think there is more that government can do. Here within my Australian context, there is no national coordinated policy or strategy about fraud. So despite the fact that we've just had $2 billion recorded as lost in 2021, there is no, I guess, fraud strategy that covers Australia, and many other countries are experiencing a similar thing. And the issue with that is that there's a lot of ad hoc approaches across different government agencies, different police, different consumer protection. There's some really great initiatives that are happening at a local level, but there is no coordination. There is no, I guess, targeted, there's no holistic approach to this in looking at best practice and looking at how we can learn from those lessons and implement it on a broader level. So I think until all countries globally start to, I guess, recognize and give priority to fraud and the impact that it has, and do that through dedicated strategy and policy that seeks to, I guess, address fraud in a robust manner, then there's always going to be challenges in this space.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cross. Just to, okay, the other even broader question. Okay, based on your presentation, this person has asked that since many people and almost everyone is vulnerable to fraud, and fraud is like persistent and evolving, how would you envision future frauds and society's response to it? Do you think we'll be fraud avoidant or resilient, or and how do you think we can emerge stronger as a collective society?
I really like this question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me this question before, so thank you very much. In terms of the future, I think I am optimistic, but also I guess our stats present a fairly dark picture. So if we look at stats globally for the past decade, we've just had more and more losses, not just here in Australia, but globally across all countries, Singapore included. So in one way, I think that will continue. So sadly, I think I'll be in this position next year talking about record losses here in Australia and record losses globally. But I do think we have potential to try and disrupt and reduce the level of victimization. I think, again, with a dedicated fraud strategy, with better prevention messaging that actually targets people more effectively, that we can try and create a society and a culture that I guess recognizes the reality of fraud and acknowledges that it exists as many other threats that we face in our daily lives, and potentially is strengthened, is resilient, and hopefully is stronger, collectively stronger. I think one of the things we need to do is to try and take away the power from the offenders, because at the moment they have all the power. So they're able to use the shame and stigma to stop victims from reporting, to stop them from disclosing, to stop them from, I guess, trying to seek help. We also know from the research that one of the greatest risk factors for fraud victimization is previous fraud victimization. So offenders are creating lists of known victims, they're sharing it, and they're kind of working collaboratively to target victims. So we need to fight back against that. We need to try and, for those that have been victim, to try and strengthen them, I guess, to future approaches, because we know that they will come. So I'm I'm optimistic for the future, but I also think just as we increase connectivity globally, as we have shifted our entire lives online as a result of COVID, and will continue to do so, that there's certainly more avenues that offenders can target, and different ways that they can leverage and potentially exploit victims. But I'd like to think that we do have some power in this situation, and we can try and reduce it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cross. That was really very engaging. You had a great presentation, and we had some great questions, and your responses to it gave us a lot of food for thought. Very unfortunately, we don't have much time left, and we may, bring back some of these questions during the next panel discussion, because there are really quite a few questions regarding this issue. Okay, thank you for your presentation, was really enjoyable. Thank you everyone for listening. We'll take a short 15-minute break and we'll come back at 9 o'clock for the panel discussion. So please do stay tuned and join us at 9 o'clock. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Cross.
Thanks.